Namaste, everyone. Thank you again for coming and talking to us for another topic. So I wanted to introduce you all to Parth. In case you don't know already, he is the president of Hindu Students Council. He joined us in 2015 when he participated in helping organize Global Dharma Conference. So he was one of the program directors at that point. And he is currently pursuing a PhD at Princeton University in economics. And aside from all the work he does with his PhD program and Hindu Students Council, he is also very active in teaching Sanskrit, Hindi, and he also has a beautiful puppy who he gave a Sanskrit name to. What's the name?
Chetak.
So I will now hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Shoni, for that gracious introduction. So the topic for this interactive presentation is Hinduism in mass media. So I think a lot of times we read the way that Hinduism and see the way that Hinduism is represented in mass media, specifically news media, in movies, and also in academia. So sometimes this makes us very angry. It may evoke an emotional reaction. So what I'm going to try to do today is try to get us to look at the elements of these stories and of these depictions that are problematic and give us the language to be able to express it to somebody else. Because sometimes when we react with anger or we react with emotion, rather than intellectualizing or verbalizing clearly what it is that we're feeling, it can actually make the problem worse, and it can give the impression that we are more extreme and that we're being unfair in a particular way. So that's what the presentation here is going to be about. And what I'm basically going to do is I'm going to go through some of the different elements and provide examples within the presentation for some interactive discussion. And in particular, I've noticed that some people, like yesterday, people were very good about not being on their phones and being very attentive. Today, we're sliding a bit back down. Thank you. So if you're ever on your phone or if you're ever talking to somebody else, I'm not going to tell you not to. I'm just going to call on you for the discussion. Okay? Which is what I do with my undergrads. Okay, great. So, does anybody recognize who this gentleman is? Anybody? Debo? Okay, so this is Reza Aslan. He's a professor of creative writing at UCLA. And Reza Aslan created this CNN episode on the Aghoris called Believer. And this was one of the most problematic depictions of Hindu Dharma in the last 4 to 5 years. And if we have time at the end, I have the whole episode on video so we can go through some excerpts of it at the very end to see if the presentation was helpful in trying to analyze and sort of deconstruct what is actually going on in these depictions, okay? So, to evaluate media bias appropriately, it's important to ask these 6 questions in any context. So the first question is, what impression does the headline of the piece give you? The headline of the piece is the first thing that anyone reads, right, when they go to a news story. Who and what are the sources that are used in the story? Are those sources biased in any particular way? Are they experts in their fields? Are there double standards in the way that the story is presented? In other words, if you substitute the labels, so for example, if you substitute, let's say, Hindu with Christian, or you substitute Hindu with Jewish or Hindu with Muslim, would that same story ever be published in that publication? Is coverage in the outlet on a variety of different topics, or is the focus solely and singularly on a particular subject, a particular angle? How does the author in this particular piece back up the assertions that she's making? And what info is crucially left out that could give the reader a more holistic impression, or that could serve as a counter-argument to what the author is saying, right? So sometimes the authors will provide facts to back them up, but there's a glaring fact, a very obvious counterexample that would demolish what they're saying. And sixth, are there photos, and this is perhaps the most important one based on how we consume media, are there photos used in the piece, and are they more prejudicial than probative? And I'll explain what that term means. It's a term that comes to us from law. Okay, so what's in a headline? So first thing to notice is that people really do skim the news in the US. A recent study that was conducted by the Media Insight Project, which is a project by the Associated Press, found that roughly 6 in 10 Americans do nothing more than read the news headline. So only 60%, the 60% of people, if they consume the news, are only going to read the headline, right? So headline is the most important part of a story. Because some people just look at the page of, let's say, the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, they look at the headline, and then it just keeps scrolling, right? So headlines are really, really important, so I want to take some time to focus on that. So Columbia University has this test that they call, Columbia School of Journalism has this test they call the TACT test for all headlines in any, for any story. So the headline has to be tasteful, right? So it can't be, in bad taste. Attention grabbing, so it has to get the reader to actually want to read the story. Unfortunately, sometimes authors only focus on the second aspect. Communicative, so it has to be able to communicate clearly what the author is actually saying and what they're going to argue. And it can't sort of have this, it can't have a double meaning in effect, right? It can't try to convey something and then convey something that's completely the opposite or some type of stereotype in the process. And then fourth is truthful. So is the headline actually right? So we can also look at headlines, for those of you who are still in college, as sort of a thesis statement. So the headline makes a claim, right, about what the author is going to try to show you in the rest of the article and the rest of the opinion piece or the rest of the news story. So that headline is very crucial because it's basically the fundamental claim that's being made by the author. Okay? So far so good? Okay, so now let's look at some examples in a non-Hindu context and let's see if we can figure out whether they pass the TACT test or not. So here's the first headline from Wall Street Journal opinion piece. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to add one point, is that oftentimes in some newspapers, a different person is writing the headline compared to the person who wrote the article, which is why there's sometimes that disconnect.
Yes, that is true. That is a good point.
And they'll do it based on like the space they have, so they'll write some different thing in.
Yeah, Shirley.
Why is that? Like, why?
So the editors typically are the ones who come up with the headlines. Sometimes editors are also the ones who come up with the photos. So this is something that's happened to me when I used to write for the Huffington Post, is I would write the article and then the pictures that were put up by somebody else. And oftentimes I didn't agree with the photo that was put up.
Or also sometimes it's based on the space so in the print journalism, it's based on the space and the layout. So the title might be written by a different person because the layout is being done by someone else.
Okay.
The person who wrote the article.
So with those caveats in mind, you can probably still come up with a headline that's better than some of these examples. So let's look at this example in the context of what Shirley presented earlier today. So this is a headline that says, "Sorry feminists, men are better at Scrabble." And then the subtitle is, "Nothing stops women from competing at the game's highest levels, but almost none of them do." Okay, so now, what is wrong with this? Let's make this interactive. What's wrong with this? Yeah, Rohan.
I think that the headline and the subheading don't exactly have anything to do with each other.
They're conflicting statements.
Yes.
Right, okay, yes, Shirley?
Well, and ask your local feminists. I'm pretty sure they don't care about Scrabble.
Right.
Like, that's not.
Right, so like we said earlier today, like feminism is about, battling the type of discrimination that exists against women and making sure that men and women are treated equally in all walks of life. And whether or not a woman is as good as a man at Scrabble has nothing to do with that, right? So this is basically like a straw man argument, because this person is trying to put down feminists by saying that, like, feminists, they think that, women are just as good at Scrabble, but this claim has never been made. So this is like you could think of it as a straw man argument, which is when you present an argument of the other side, which is not what the other side claims at all, right? Or you can just think of them as just wanting to bash feminism through some piece that has nothing to do with feminism at all.
And written by a woman. Yeah, it was like.
Yes, it was written by a woman. So here's the second example, and this is we're getting to a more Hindu example. So does anybody recognize this gentleman on the right-hand side? Yeah.
The guy who tried to convert the Sentinel missionary.
Yes, exactly. So he's the missionary from the U.S. who tried to convert the people in the Sentinel Islands on the Andaman Nicobar island chain in India. So that's him. So he died, right? So this piece that's published in The Spectator, which is a conservative news piece in the U.S., says, "It is time we civilize the Sentinelese people." So this is the headline that's based off of the death of this American missionary.
He died or he was killed?
He was killed. He was killed. Yes, thank you. He was killed. He was killed by the Sentinelese because he was invading their land, basically. Okay, so what do we think about this headline? Tasteful?
No.
Why isn't it tasteful, Sneha?
Are you kidding me on this?
Because you said no, so I'm asking you why.
I mean, the word civilized,
Yeah.
that's kind of problematic because, you know, civilization is,
It's more about.
depends on your perspective of what is civilization.
Right. Right.
Like, they're just showing the Christian aspect, the Judeo-Christian aspect of civilization.
Right. Very good. Yes?
Like, how can someone out from outside tell somebody that they don't even know about if they're civilized or not? What are you trying to say? They're uncivilized? Like, who are you to be saying that?
Exactly. And Sindhu, you had something to say?
I also find it interesting just the use of the word we in that sentence, which creates just this dichotomy of us versus them.
Yeah.
Where we, and this theme keeps popping up over and over in this camp, which is we apply the Western framework and viewpoint to everything else because that's all we know. And it's just interesting that there's such confidence in we in the West, and that makes everything else inferior.
Yeah, and specifically in this case, I would say we is probably like Western person, but also white person, civilizing Sentinelese who are a darker skinned people. Yeah.
The way it is framed, like it is time we civilized. So I'm like, it is time. What do you mean? It's like more about invading the like.
Right.
More of like an authoritative stuff. Like it's more of like a dictator. Like it's time we are going to do this.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Like in terms of like invading their land and invading the island and just forcing your vision, like Sneha was saying, like your vision of what it means to be civilized on other people is very wrong. Right, so that's what is problematic about this headline clearly. Taking some of the aspects that we just talked about from like imposing a Western framework on other people, let's consider this first example. So this is taken from a leading conservative American daily. Does anybody know which one it is? CNN. It's not CNN. No, it's not Fox. Oh yeah, sorry, it's the Wall Street Journal. So you can recognize it from the fonts that are used. So hopefully, like after this presentation, you'll be able to recognize news articles just by the fonts that are used. Okay, but this headline is India turns west but away from Western values. That's the headline. Subheadline is the country's first pro-American prime minister also stands for intolerant Hindu nationalism. So, tact test here. What is wrong with this headline?
That's a false positive. That's a false positive.
False positive in what sense?
They are trying to make up something which is wrong in a positive manner.
What do you mean by in a positive manner?
Like the way it is framed, India turns west but away from Western values.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like it's false. First of all, we are not turning west, so that's false. But they are interpreting in a way like, oh, we can do it. That's a positive sign. So that's a false positive.
Yeah. Yeah. Rohan.
Oh, okay. I think it's what's more problem. I mean, I think the initial headline is problematic, but at least he's identifying, or she, I think, is identifying.
It's a guy. Tunku's a guy.
At least they're like identifying that it's like Western values. I think it would be even worse if they said put away from like civilized values, like something like in the last example. And so I think that is still problematic, but the subheading is even worse. It's grouping him in. It's grouping him in with the intolerant Hindu nationalist group, which I'm not sure that like that's like very like. I feel like the reporting on that is going to be, more than slightly biased, and probably not going to give the full picture.
Right.
And it's not saying that there are two perspectives, or that this is the majority perspective. It's saying that this is the truth.
Okay, so problem with being truthful. Yeah, Neil.
So I think the term Western values in that context is very problematic because we can't see the whole article, but presumably the values that the author is referring to are things like democracy, freedom, secularism, respect for human rights, and those things. In so many other contexts, we hear those are meant to be universal values.
Right.
I think they are universal values. And when we say that that's things like democracy and liberalism are something that are only a Western concept and that somehow belong to or originate in Western tradition alone, I think that's inherently excluding not just Hindu or any one tradition, that's excluding every other culture of the world, and that attitude and that positioning when somebody is trying to spread these universal values, when they try to spread it as this is a Western thing that you should adopt, right? It's easy to imagine why many countries, I mean, not just Indians are not just Hindus, right? But the Chinese, Singaporeans, Japanese, Africans, many other cultures are understandably resistant to the idea. If these are universal core values, right, then to describe it from that perspective, right? If you say these are only Western values, well, then why should the world follow them?
Good. So I think we hit all the points that I was thinking of. So first of all, it's not. So this is what you were saying. It's not communicated at all what the Western values he's talking about even are, right? In the headline or in the subheading, right? So is he talking about democracy as a Western value, or is he talking about Western colonization as something that's defined Western history for centuries? Or is he talking about Western pop culture? We simply have no idea from just from the headline what he's talking about. So it fails C.
And regime change.
Yeah, regime change wars, which Tulsi Gabbard is battling against. So was India ever a repository of Western values? If you're saying that it's turning away from Western values, can you point to a time and period when India was a repository of those values and that it's now rejecting those values? I don't think you really can, right? India isn't a Western country, so why shouldn't it be turning away from Western values? Why should it be embodying those values? And why can its own civilizational heritage define its own version of modernity? So I think a lot of times when these pieces are written, there's like an implicit thing where we're saying basically that when you turn away from Western values, you're turning away from modernity. I think that's a huge implication of this headline, especially when you read the subtext, which is intolerant Hindu nationalism, right? We're going backwards in time is kind of the implication. You're turning away from modernity is the implication. So why can't your own civilizational heritage form the backbone of your own vision for what it means to be modern? That's something that China has asked a lot by basing their development on Confucian values, and it's something that India is now asking with Prime Minister Modi being re-elected. Why can't we base our development on Dharma? So that's that point. And then also it says Modi is the first pro-American Prime Minister. First, you can contest labeling somebody as pro-American and anti-American, but if we're going to argue, then I would say that there have been other pro-American Prime Ministers before Modi as well. So that's that. So here's the second one. So this is from a leading liberal daily to show that bias happens on both sides of the ideological spectrum. Can anybody recognize which newspaper this is from?
New York Times.
No, it's not New York Times. It's not the Huffington Post. It's the Washington Post. So this is a piece by Annie Gowan in the Washington Post. It says, cows are sacred to India's Hindu majority. For Muslims who trade cattle, that means growing trouble. And that's the headline. So what is wrong with the headline? There's many things wrong, but yeah, go ahead.
I think it's implying that there's like a lot of violence, or that the Muslims are like living in a dangerous or precarious situation. Right. I don't know if there's enough support for that.
Right. Shivang, you were going to say something?
So it's saying that basically cow is sacred to Indians in the bigger context, considering Hindus, but this also including the fact that Muslims use cow as a trading thing. So again, the controversy is there in the statement itself.
Yeah.
What it's trying to convey the meaning. One side it says that it's sacred to Hindus, and on the other side it's saying indirectly that Indian Hindus might be against Muslims now because they use cow as trading business thing,
Right. Christine?
Like, why are you saying that in the first place? There's already tension between Hindus and Muslims. Like, are you trying to incite trouble, like, from us?
Right.
Like, that's like the biggest problem with this.
Right. So the assumption here is that because it's only Muslims who trade cattle, and all Muslims trade cattle in a way, right? That means that there's going to be growing trouble, that immediately there's going to be tensions because Hindus think that cows are sacred. Yeah, go ahead.
So also like what's different? So it's like, okay, Hindus are in the majority, cows are sacred. Some Muslims may be trading cows. What's different? Why is it a growing issue all of a sudden?
Good. So I think we've touched on all the points I wanted to mention. So we've discussed that Muslims trade cattle and eat beef, therefore Hindus inherently have a reason to hate them. It overly simplifies the issue of cattle theft and Muslim quote-unquote lynching as a result of this. So you can see that there's a huge economic reason why this is happening now, because basically farmers, like, cows are their livelihood in a way, right? We saw that in Manikarnika, like when somebody, like the British soldier, took her cow away, that was something that was very painful for her, because she like believed that the calf, the bachara, was like her child in a way, right? That's how she thought of Nandu in the movie. So similarly, like if you're a farmer, the cow is kind of your, not only like a part of your family if you're a devout Hindu, but also part of your economic livelihood, right? So what's happening now is, you know, I don't have that much time to go into it, but over the last 10 years, since 2010, there was an explicit policy when the UPA government was in power to encourage meat consumption. So the food and processing minister said at a conference that his goal was to make sure that meat consumption increases from 10 grams per capita to 50 grams per capita. And the reason and the way that they were going to try to accomplish this was by providing subsidies to people who were engaging in the slaughter business and engaging in transport of meat. Yeah.
The way it was framed. So if it would have framed differently, like for example, Muslim worship pig, but American ate like. If you see among all the countries, Americans are the biggest consumer of pork. So
Muslims don't worship pigs, but
no, but like whatever, like they are saying something.
They don't eat pigs.
They don't eat pigs. Or some religious through but that will spark a debate,
right?
And that will bring some resentment in like the USA.
Yes. Okay, so I think we covered.
You just said it's the so-called pink revolution, right?
Yeah, it's the so-called pink revolution. So I wrote 2 pieces about this actually in the Huffington Post. So you can check those out when you have time if you want to. Also, notice the way that this is framed, right? Hindu majority, large group of people. Muslims are a smaller group of people. Right? So there's this asymmetry that's being put into the article where like you have a large group of people who, you know, are just baying for the blood of Muslims basically, right? Because they're trading cattle. That's sort of the implication of the headline. Okay? So those are the 2 examples that we're going to go with for headlines. So hopefully you have some of the material, some of the examples now you know about how you can evaluate whether a headline is fair or unfair. Okay? So the next question that we're going to go on to are who are the sources that are used within the story itself? Is the source that's used an expert on the topic? What is her perspective on the topic of the article? And does he or she have a bias, right? So when a lot of times we see somebody quoted in an article, we have to think about, you know, does this person have a reason to be taking the stance that they're taking? Does this person have a particular viewpoint that they have said in another context that would affect their view on this issue? So we should be asking these types of questions. What are the sources actually contributing to the stories? So in any good news article, you would expect that the source is either providing evidence for something that the author is saying, right? So if the author is arguing, you know, about, let's say that climate change is a huge problem, they might want to quote a scientist as saying why climate change is a huge problem. Or it might be providing a typical or demonstrative personal account of a problem. So for example, if we were talking about an article that had to do with floods, let's say in Houston, right? Hurricane Harvey, right? If we were talking about that, you might want to interview somebody who was there affected by the floods and ask him, you know, what was your experience like? Like what happened to your house? How are you going to get your life back together? So that readers have an idea of the human toll that this phenomenon is causing and that evokes a sympathetic reaction, right? And the last question, which is also really important, is a relevant voice left out from the article? So who's missing? Whose perspective, which may be critical to us understanding this story, is actually not there? Okay.
The subject itself.
The subject itself. So for Hinduism, it often ends up being a Hindu voice. So this is an example from the Washington Post again. So this is actually an article about the Hindu community's reaction to CNN's Believer episode. So, Ishpreet, would you like to read the first paragraph here?
Sure. Some viewers turned to Twitter to express their anger about the program. One of the loudest voices on the social media platform belonged to wealthy Indian American industrialist Shalabh Kumar, who made significant contributions to Donald Trump's presidential campaign and his angle to become a US ambassador to India. Kumar seemed to perceive the episode as an attack on Hindu Americans who voted for Trump, although Aslan didn't mention Trump.
Okay, and Christine, would you like to read the last paragraph?
Sure. Disgusting attack on Hindus for supporting POTUS, Kumar tweeted, invoking the Clinton News Network, a label that Trump helped popularize. Kumar wrote in a follow-up tweet that the network had no respect for the members of the religion. He called for Hindus to boycott CNN.
Right. Okay, so now we see that Shailab Kumar, who's the founder of the Republican Hindu Coalition, is quoted as a source in this article that's about why CNN's Believer episode is catching grief from Hindus. Okay, so what is his commentary contributing to this article? Yeah, Neil.
So I think there's two aspects that I would call problematic with this. One is, without seeing the rest of the article, right, but at least this portion, what it does is it says, okay, some Hindus are criticizing Reza Islam, okay, and it does bring in a Hindu voice, but it brings in a voice that's essentially equating criticism of this episode with support for Trump.
Right.
Right? Even though those things are unrelated, right? And the implication, maybe other parts of the article give this more context, but from just this, the implication is that the Hindus who support Trump are the ones criticizing this episode, which I think is not true, right? And so it's, in reality, just purely from election data, a large majority of Hindu American voters voted against Trump.
Yes.
Right? And so I wouldn't call this person a representative voice.
Exactly, yeah.
And that said, even if that's the voice they want to take, it doesn't sound like they actually talked to him directly. They just got his tweet popped up somewhere.
That's a good point.
Putting that without, if they're taking this Shailab Kumar as their voice for Hindus' criticism of Islam, they should at least talk to him directly rather than just putting his tweet in the part.
Yeah, that's a really good point you make, that they didn't even, so I think the first point you made is very valid. But even then, they didn't even interview him, right? So they just took his tweet and just extrapolated from there. Anything else? Yeah, Avi.
I mean, one of the things is, if this is going to go a little deeper, just based on what I've seen, Trump seems to be having a constant back and forth with CNN. That's one of the many news media that he seems to have issue with. But they seem to be using this as kind of okay, this guy is a Trump supporter, so obviously he's going to bash CNN, and kind of using that to leverage their point of view.
Yeah. So another reason why I think, yeah, go ahead, Rohan.
I think it's almost irrelevant to say that he is angled to become a U.S. ambassador to India, or that he's made contributions to Trump's presidential campaign. If you're talking about Reza Aslan and about him catching grief for showcasing these cannibals or whatever, I feel like that doesn't really have anything at all to do with Shailab Kumar's contributions to different funds. It has more to do with the opinions of people who watched the episode, which doesn't seem to be what they're going for.
Yes, and so in defense of this article, which I don't like, they quoted one other Hindu voice, which is Vamsi Jaluri, who we'll hear from later. But this is actually how the article ends. So the last thing, this disgusting Clinton News Network thing, is the last sentence of the article. So we have to think about how the article is book-ended. And if you're ending the article like that, it's problematic. Yeah, Sindhu.
I'm just gonna say there's red herrings everywhere. Every single adjective and every single sentence is trying to invoke a certain idea in your head. When it says wealthy Indian American industrialist, I feel like it's trying to invoke ideas, once again aligned with Trump, but also it's this top level and they're people you cannot empathize with. And then when it says has angled to become a U.S. ambassador, none of this is actually relevant.
Right.
If they wanted to understand who's actually feeling grievous about this story, then they should have I feel surveyed people and surveyed just average people who are tweeting about it, but instead they just happened to pick this guy.
Yeah, and again, so I think what you're saying, and also going back to Neil's point, his commentary doesn't provide any context about what's wrong with the episode, right? He's just saying Clinton News Network. Yeah, Haley.
I was going to say they're using different people's names and statuses to get credibility without actually talking to them or getting actual content. And another thing that I feel like that's problematic is that they're using the disagreement or rage for one topic and they're trying to divert it to Hindu population. And I feel like that is really problematic because you're now connecting Trump with Hindu.
Yes, very good point. So very good point. So a lot of the coverage that we're seeing now also about Modi is saying like, in fact, one newspaper headline is like "Our Trump." So they're so like in like the American mind, it's like Modi is Trump. Hindus like Modi. Therefore, all Hindus, even the ones who are protesting this, must be Hindu nationalists because look at Shalabh Kumar, he's on the Trump team. So these arrows are implicitly being drawn in these articles, and this is drawn in a way that, you know, if you just read this article and you didn't think about it, you might not notice. Yeah, Aman, go ahead.
Is it me or like the most disturbing thing of them all is like the headline?
Yeah, the religious.
Yeah, it is.
Like his Greek Orthodox.
I mean, he does do this in the TV show, so I don't know how else you would say it. Yeah, go ahead.
I feel like by saying like religious cannibals and it's kind of a myth.
I see. Yes, you're right. Yes.
Like implying that this is like a significant phenomenon in India that's been covered and that people are getting upset about instead of it being like a very, very niche extremist thing that people don't really.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I'll just go to Debo and then we have to move on because we're spending a lot of time on this. Yeah.
Also, the title implies that CNN's Believer Show did nothing wrong and showcasing something that was already happening instead of saying that, all right, this is fair criticism of a show that was perpetrating problematic views.
Right, exactly. Sorry, we have to move on. I know we could discuss this a lot, but we have a lot we need to get to. So this is an example, that was an example, right, of where including a voice doesn't add anything, it can actually create stereotypes. So let's look at what happens when you exclude voices from the conversation. So it's a general phenomenon that people tend to be moved more by personal accounts rather than by statistics. So if you think about commercials like the Children's Hospital commercials like St. Jude's or Children's Hospital Philadelphia, the reason why they have these like cute children that are from like the pediatric oncology center is because they really want to invoke sympathy and they want to put a personal human face on it so that you feel moved to rightfully give to save these children's lives, right? So that's very important to have a personalized face that you can say is connected with this issue, rather than presenting a voiceless, faceless movement of just Hindu nationalism presenting these labels, which we'll get to in a second. So when sources are intended to provide such a personalized representative account, they can provide a complex and humanizing vision of the world, and a lack of such accounts reduces people to the stereotypes that I was mentioning. And similarly, when sources are intended to provide evidence, it can leave out crucial facts that might be relevant for the discussion. So for example, we've been mentioning like if you interviewed a Hindu person, if you interviewed somebody on a topic relating to Hinduism and you didn't interview a Hindu organization, then that's pretty much like you're not doing your job properly as a journalist, right? You're leaving out crucial evidence that could, if it was there, change the opinion of the reader. And sometimes, even when it's included, it's immediately undermined in the next line. So they'll quote somebody, and then they'll immediately undermine it in the next line. And they'll say like, but many people disagree, or something like that, where they won't do that with other people. So also how the source is treated within the article, even if they're quoted, is important. So this is an analysis by the professor I was mentioning, Vamsi Jaluri. This is from an article in Pragita that was published 2 weeks ago about the US coverage of the Indian elections. So, basically the idea of this is that Muslim voices are presented at a very personalized, humanized level. So in this article in the New York Times, the first example, under Modi, a Hindu nationalist surge has further divided India, we see that the article begins with Adnan, a Muslim in a machine tools market, where he's quoted as saying their voices, when he's talking to Adnan, their voices drop to a whisper. I could be lynched right now, says Adnan. So they're giving a very chilling and personalized account of what a Muslim supposedly goes through on a day-to-day basis by providing Adnan as a personalized account. So if you're reading the story, you think that this is a representative account of what a Muslim faces in even in Delhi, right, which is the capital of India and where there's a very large Muslim population, especially in Old Delhi. Similarly, after nearly 27 years after a Hindu mob destroyed a mosque, they're talking about Babri Mosque, the scars in India remain deep. So they're talking about Saeed Ikhlaq Latif, who's another Muslim person, and his wife, Tayyib Nisa, says, "I've wept a lifetime of tears. Her husband was killed in the Babri Masjid demolition." So, we can go on, but the basic idea is that Muslim voices are presented in a very humanizing way, and I would actually argue that if there's violence against somebody, they should be presented in that humanizing way, but the reciprocal treatment is never meted out to Hindus. Right, so there's very, very little evidence or examples of Hindus that are victims of crimes ever being given the similar treatment where they're quoted in a way that humanizes them. If they're ever quoted, they'll always be quoted in a way that dehumanizes them, that shows them as extremists. So do you have anything to say? No? Okay.
I'm just thinking what you were saying. Go.
Yeah, Shivan, go ahead.
I think all these disputes where they try to, mention that Muslims nowadays in India have been, lynched around.
Yeah.
I think this all controversy would come to an end, and by the time we resolve the temple issue, the Ayodhya issue, because everything is rated and undermined around that all the time, and that's how even the international media sometimes even something which is targets around that. So once that dispute is settled in a nice manner, I think all this controversial is too.
So it would be nice to think in this way, that everything will be resolved in the next 5 years. It's not going to happen. And the reason why it's not going to happen is because there's always going to be violence from community A against community B and community B against community A. The question is, if you're only focusing almost exclusively on one side of the violence and you're not reporting what's happening on the other side. So there's documented cases where the violence happens in the other direction, and both should get coverage, right? Both are important facts for us to know and understand what's happening in India, but the other side doesn't get any coverage, it's selective. Yeah, go ahead.
So I think part of the problem is, increasingly over the years, especially after 9/11, people have become very sensitive around the topic of Muslims. So they're more likely probably to show their personal tones as to, kind of show the other perspective that, not all Muslims are terrorists and whatnot. So, and Hindus, we kind of haven't been involved in all these big drama type things.
Right.
We're not involved in terrorist attacks. If anything happens, it happens within India. So although this stuff happens within India, since we're not more involved in these kind of big stuff on an international